Welcome, everyone. This is lecture 5 of Emma, and I'm going to make an attempt today and next week to catch up. So I'm not going to go quite as slowly as I had been, just because we're going to run out of time, and the novel is just too good to um, shortchange anything. So the first thing I want to do is take a look at a lecture presented by P.D. James, the mystery writer, um, about Emma's being a detective story. And at first you may think, no, that's not what we're looking at. But it's this the article and several others that correspond are pretty convincing. So let me just read you a few bits about this. The title is Emma Considered as a Detective Story. My title this afternoon is Emma Considered as a Detective Story. It may seem presumptuous as well as a little eccentric to consider one of the greatest novels written in the English language with reference to conventions of popular genre fiction. Apart from this presumption, the detective story is, after all, usually concerned with a murder, and there is no crime in Emma if we accept the despoiling of Mrs. Weston's turkey houses. We haven't gotten there yet, but we will. Few orthodox detective novels are so rural, so peaceable, so remote in spirit from the crime and violence of Jane Austen's own age or of ours. But the detective story does not require a murder. Dorothy L. Sayers' Gaudy Night is an example. What it does require is a mystery, which are hidden from the reader, but which he or she should be able to discover by logical deductions from clues inserted in the novel. Isn't that interesting? There's clues all over this book. With they are deposited with inserted with deceptive cunning, but essential fairness. It is about evaluating evidence, whether of events or character. It is concerned with a bringing, some of this I can't read, bringing out of disorder and restoring peace and tranquility to a temporarily disruptive by the intrusion of alien influences. Emma most faultlessly constructed of all Jane Austen's novels has a story in which peace and reconciliation are produced out of discord. Mysteries are elucidated and facts previously misinterpreted a lot by Emma are at last seen in their true light. But there are other interesting parallels with the traditional detective story. The genre is often at its most effective when the setting is self contained and the people are forced into sometimes unwilling proximity. Here in Emma, we have a self contained rural community in which virtually all the characters in the book either live in or near the village of Highbury or, like Frank Churchill, are concerned with it. Only Mrs. Elton comes in as a stranger when she marries the vicar. Oops. Well, that's not a huge deal. We know them all completely in the sense that we imagine what they would say and how they would behave when we are not there. We know intimately the life of Highbury. She goes on, against the self contained background is played out the drama of Emma, handsome, clever, and rich, whose energy and powers of mind are fatefully underused so that she occupies herself in disastrous inferences in the lives of others. That's exactly Emma. Emma, in her zeal to manipulate and control, misinterprets facts, emotions, situations, relationships, and it is a fair guess that the 19th century reader and the modern reader, coming to the novel for the first time, would be seduced by Jane Austen's cleverness in inducing us to share Emma's misconceptions and misunderstandings. So you have to be on alert for those misconceptions, and I think by the time you've gotten as far as we have, you see these misconceptions. What then are the mysteries in Emma? All of them center on a human relationship. Okay, I'm going to just not say that part. Still in the effort to not give away everything. Let's see. We share the lively interest in Highbury in seeing Mr. Weston's long expected son, and we see that today. And we may perhaps agree that Mr. Knightley, that that young man certainly should have come earlier to pay his respects to his father's new bride, poor Miss Taylor, as Mr. Woodhouse calls her. Um, so more in here that I want to say today. Maybe not. We'll come back to that one, but isn't that interesting? There's more. I'm not going to read this whole article, but here are some mysteries that we should be cognizant of as we're reading. First, we learn that Frank has never been to Highbury and that he fails to come even after his father's marriage. Yeah, and there's quite a bit of talk about that. Um, Mr. Knightley thinks him a trifling little fellow. Um, then we know that Emma is suspicious about Jane's attachment to Mr. Dixon. Mr. Dixon, if you recall, is the fella who married Mrs. Dixon, who was the governess. All right, and then we already know that Frank and Jane have both been to Weymouth. So these resort towns play a kind of a background role. We hear about them all the time. Frank is in and out of Bath and Weymouth, and Austen drops these little tidbits about these places. Another mystery. This is odd. Frank's sudden trip to London might have aroused suspicion were it not that all who comment on it, especially the usually reliable Mr. Knightley, seem to accept without question that traveling 16 miles for a haircut is perfectly in keeping with Frank's character. So it's not like us leaving from Cedarburg and going to Bayshore in order to go shopping. I think that's about 11 miles. But we know that a 16-mile journey on horseback or in a carriage is a big deal. So here he goes off to get a haircut. Um, um, Knightley grumbles, just the trifling silly fellow I took him for. Then another element, just something to pay attention to, is the arrival of the pianoforte. The piano, so Jane, we know, is a better singer and better piano player than Emma. And but she doesn't have a piano to play. And just on the side, the piano was the most popular musical instrument of the day, and there were two kinds. One was the traditional grand piano, shaped like, somewhere in my notes it says it's shaped like a wing, whereas the pianoforte was a little boxy affair, and it was not quite as desirable, not quite as expensive, shall we say, as the wing-shaped kind of piano. Um, so the piano arrives, and everybody's all a twitter about the piano. When, as this author says, oh, did I even tell you who this was? I didn't. David H. Bell. He has been teaching classes in Austen's novels at California State University, Sacramento. He is a life member of the Jane Austen Society. Um, Jane gave me a pile of books in a bag from a meeting of the Jane Austen Society. You want to see? Look at this bag. Isn't that nice? So when I return all my books to Gina, put them back in the bag because the bag is really very interesting. Um, anyway, so the circumstance, the fact that Jane and Frank have spent time together at one of these resorts is overshadowed by the arrival of this pianoforte. And you just need to watch the clues about this. Um, right, so I'm trying really hard not to give away too much of the end of the story. But beyond delighting, oh, this is another article, and this was in the Jane Austen Society 1991. Beyond delighting in the sublime silliness made possible by rereading every text as if it were a mystery story, there are parallels between Emma and the classical tale of mystery and detection. And at first, I didn't really believe it, but if you think about it, I think that's what's so appealing about Austen is that she drops these subtle little clues. And if you're just reading along trying to figure out the plot and figure out the characters, you may not realize that you are being handed a clue. There are parallels between Emma and the classical tale of mystery and detection, especially as it had been practiced in England, which encourage us to compare the two. And I would suggest such a comparison may in fact help us better appreciate the richness of this great novel. I think that's really true. Like a detective story, Emma presents a concrete material world for our close inspection, although the novel does not fully endorse the idea that, quote, manners were all that could be safely judged of. And that's in the novel. It provides ample evidence that manners are indeed highly revelatory. Jane Austen did not need Sherlock Holmes to show her the great issues that may hang from a bootlace. In other words, the issues that are subtle, tiny little clues. Focusing on human relationships and quirks, her novels share with the classic English mystery the capacity to imply the wider world from which they come and are often considered documents of their times. This emphasis on the actual mundane world is, of course, a distinguishing characteristic of English fiction generally. Dorothy L. Sayers has commented about the mystery story, and it is integral to that tradition because it, too, is steeped in that unreasonable poetry of things that informs English narrative literature from Chaucer and Shakespeare to the present day. So we'll come back to those, but I think that is really convincing, and I've given you some of the elements um, that are elements of the mystery that you have to pay attention to. It's really quite entertaining. All right, so I know that we stopped on page 127, the beginning of chapter 16. As I said, I'm going to try and pick this up a little bit because we are, I'm getting mired in the detail. It's just so entertaining to take a look at this. So, chapter 16, um, Emma begins to awaken to her own um, mistakes. Um, this is in this chapter, poor Harriet has to be told that Mr. Elton has gone off and gotten himself engaged. Um, but the weather keeps everybody at home. At the beginning of this chapter, uh, the the hair is curled, the maid is sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. This is her feelings. And once again, that is one of the things that Austen is able to bring into the fiction. It was a wretched business indeed, such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for, such a development of everything most unwelcome, such a blow for Harriet. She finally gets to poor Harriet. Um, with the maid gone, Emma finally on her own, she can give vent to her feelings. Um, Thus, there is one short declarative sentence after another to convey how Emma is being overwhelmed with one acute regret after another and is unable for the moment even to articulate more complex thoughts. Um, That was the worst of all, is what has been done to Harriet. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or another. But compared with the evil to Harriet, and that's the point, all was light, and she would gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistaken, more in error, more disgraced by misjudgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. But in fact, Emma's able to recognize that the effects go beyond Emma's own misjudgments and blunders to hurt Harriet. The real concern, next paragraph, is poor Harriet. Next paragraph. She had taken up the idea, she supposed, and made everything bend to it. His manners, however, must have been unmarked, wavering, dubious, or she could not have been so misled. So we see that Mr. Elton was misled by Emma's apparent interest in him. So she was thinking that she's being extra nice to Mr. Elton for Harriet's benefit, but what Elton thought was Emma was interested in him. The picture, how eager he had been about the picture. Remember the picture and the charade? Neither of them were very good. Well, the picture of Emma or of Harriet was okay, but Mr. Knightley points out that Emma manipulated it a little bit in Harriet's favor. At the top of 128, he had not always lived in the best society. That, with all the gentleness of his address, true elegance was sometimes wanting. Now she's beginning to see his flaws. She was just playing with him. And then on the little bit further down, Mr. Knightley had once said to her about Mr. Elton, the caution he had given, the conviction he had professed that Mr. Elton would never marry indiscreetly. One of the clues that we are often given about this society, not that these clues are not necessarily contributing to the detective story, but we are given clues about the importance of social status. And Mr. Elton is just as concerned about his position as anybody else. He was proud, assuming, conceited, very full of his own claims, and little concerned about the feelings of others. Unfortunately, in some ways, that is also Emma. Remember, on the first day, I told you that what we're going to see here is the evolution of Emma. And this is step one. Towards the bottom of page 128, let's see, look down upon her friends so well understanding the gradations of rank below him, and be so blind to what rose above as to fancy himself showing no presumption in addressing her. It was most provoking. So she's annoyed that Mr. Elton, would presume to be interested in Emma. She's annoyed by that. I'm so grand, and he's beneath me, is what we're getting here. On page 129, she sort of admits her error. Emma was obliged, in common honesty, to stop and admit that her own behavior to him had been so complacent and obliging, so full of courtesy and attention, as supposing her real motive unperceived might warrant a man of ordinary observation and delicacy, like Mr. Elton, in fancying himself a very decided favorite. If she had so misinterpreted his feelings, she had little right to wonder that he, with self-interest to blind him, should have mistaken hers. So she at least is able to see that she was the culprit here. down at the top of at the top of page 130. Oh, that I have been satisfied with persuading her not to accept young Martin. There's the rub. There I was quite right. That was well done of me, but there I should have stopped. So she's not going to admit everything. She still thinks of young Martin as a farmer, yeomanry, and she's very condescending about that. Um, in the middle, page 130. Oh, let's see. So, where's my beginning? Where's my beginning? Let's see, in the middle, page 130. Um, the distressing explanation she had to make to Harriet, and all that poor Harriet would be suffering with the awkwardness of future meetings, the difficulties of continuing or discontinuing the acquaintance, of subduing feelings, concealing resentment, and avoiding eclat, or the motivation to talk. They were enough to occupy her in the most unmirthful reflections some time longer, and she went to bed at last with nothing settled but the conviction of her having blundered most dreadfully. And we we agree. She's not going to give in about the Mr. Martin thing, but she is giving in with her manipulation of the situation. Um, let's see. This is over. This is at the last part of the chapter. The last paragraph. This is the last part of the chapter. Yes. But with all the hopes of cheerfulness and all the present comfort delay, there was still such an evil hanging over her in the hour of explanation with Harriet as made it impossible for Emma to be ever perfectly at ease. So I kind of, it's almost a high schoolish kind of thing where you make a blunder and then you don't want to run into that person ever again because it's embarrassing. Um, and that is what this seems. This is such a isolated little town. People don't really leave it much. They can't. It's difficult to travel. If we go and look at chapter 17, Elton goes to Bath. He's kind of a frivolous sort of guy, and he goes to these resorts quite a lot. At the beginning of the chapter, page 132, Isabella, this is Emma's sister, poor Isabella, as Mr. Woodhouse would say. She has gotten married to Mr. John Knightley, Mr. Knightley's brother, and they live in London. Um, Poor Isabella, passing her life with those she doted on, full of their merits, blind to their faults, and always innocently busy, might have been a model of right feminine happiness. And that might be true. I have a note on this one. On the other hand, Jane Austen consistently shows a high regard for women with sharper intellects and greater force of character than Isabella. So there's a little irony implied there, and would not consider the latter the best model for women. The line may simply be intended to put Mr. Woodhouse in an ironic light, since prevailing opinion would consider Isabella's situation an excellent one, and Mr. Woodhouse never indicates any dissent from established opinion. His pity is completely misplaced. Remember, he calls her poor Isabella all the time, as if to pity her, but then she's presented as the ideal feminine position, but that is ironic because it is a not flattering comparison. Let's see, in the middle of the next two paragraphs, she admitted Emma was most agreeably surprised. Mr. Elton's absence just at this time was the very thing to be desired. He's gone. Thank God, because then nobody has to see him and be embarrassed in front of him. She admired him for contriving it, though not able to give him much credit for the manner in which it was announced. Remember, he sent a really formal letter taking his leave, and it was completely unnecessary. Resentment could not have been more plainly spoken than in a civility to her father, from which she was so pointedly excluded. Um, that note interesting. Since he is simply going away for a short vacation, there is no need for him to communicate such an elaborate farewell, nor is there any reason to offer any grand expression of gratitude for the ordinary social intercourse he maintained with the Woodhouses. But he writes this letter and leaves Emma out, and it's inappropriate. Page 134. Her tears fell abundantly, but her grief was truly artless. This is Harriet. That no dignity could have made it more respectable in Emma's eyes. And she listened to her and tried to console her with all her heart and understanding, really for the time convinced that Harriet was the superior creature of the two. And if we go to page 135, um, oh, yeah. This is 134. In the middle of the page, time she knew must be allowed for this being thoroughly done. She could not suppose herself but an indifferent judge of such matters in general, and very inadequate to sympathize in an attachment to Mr. Elton in particular. I wrote in my margin, MYOB. Mind your own business. Sometimes she is annoyingly in other people's business. So she's trying to protect Harriet. Um, at the bottom, this is the top of 135. They're being fixed, so absolutely fixed in this same place was bad for each, not for all three, or for all three. Not one of them had the power of removal. This is Harriet, Emma, and Elton. They could not leave. Elton could leave more easily than the women. Not one of them had the power of removal or of effecting any material change of society. They must encounter each other and make the best of it. Chapter 18. Once again, Frank, this is Frank Churchill, who's the um, more or less adopted son of Mr. Weston, who has married Mrs. Weston. And so he should have come to pay his respects to his father at his new marriage, and once again he didn't. And Knightley says in this chapter that Mr. Frank Churchill should have paid his respects, and in not doing so, he has sidestepped social protocol. Um, 4 paragraphs in, Emma was not at this time in a state of spirits to care really about Mr. Frank Churchill's not coming, except as a disappointment at Randall's. Randall's is the Weston's household. And Mrs. Weston is very worried about this. She's the second wife. The acquaintance at present had no charm for her. She wanted rather to be quiet and out of temptation, but still, as it was desirable that she should appear in general like her usual self, she took care to express as much interest in the circumstances. So remember, a few pages ago, it was actually last week, Emma had kind of an interest in Mr. Frank Churchill, even though she hadn't met him. And now she kind of puts him off and is no longer interested, again suggesting how easily she goes from one social interest to another. At the top of page 137. Oh, yeah, 137. Um, The Churchills are very likely in fault, said Mr. Knightley coolly, but I dare say he might come if he would. So there's some blame being thrown here at the people with whom Mr. Frank Church lives. Mrs. Churchill, I forget their names, isn't his wife. This is that old aunt who, and they apparently don't allow him a great deal of freedom. Um, Next paragraph. I, I am not supposing him at all an unnatural creature, and suspecting that he may have learnt to be above his connections and to care very little for anything but his own pleasure. Don't forget that Knightley is often a reliable source, not always, but often. That a young man brought up by those who are proud, luxurious, and selfish should be proud, luxurious, and selfish too. Interesting. Down, let's see, this is at the top of page 138. Oh, here's the clue about Frank and Jane. The two of them were both at Weymouth. I think it's Weymouth is how you say that. He was at Weymouth, which is a resort. This proves that he can leave the Churchills. So Knightley is arguing that he's not coming because he's not doing his duty, and he goes to these resorts so he can clearly leave the custody, the clutches, and that's the way it's being presented, the clutches of the aunt. Um, Middle of page 138, there is one thing, Emma, um, which a man can always do if he chooses, and that is his duty, not by maneuvering and finessing, but by vigor and resolution. It is Frank Church's duty to pay his attention to his father. So we have to listen to Mr. Knightley. That is, he's, remember, the quintessential English gentleman, and he's voicing the concern about um, Churchill's lack of interest and paying his respects to his father. Um, Down at the bottom, oh no, this is the top of 139. Respect would be added to affection. And that's probably true. Um, so Mr. Knightley seems to be um, condescending about Frank Church's behavior. Um, at the top of page, oh no, this is 139. That the nephew, who had done rightly by his father, would do rightly by them. And a few lines later, respect for right conduct is felt by everybody. And then the top of page 140, your amiable young man is a very weak young man. If this be the first occasion of his carrying through a resolution to do right against the will of others, it ought to have been a habit with him by this time of following his duty instead of consulting expediency. So the picture that he paints about Frank Churchill is that he's rich and spoiled and not doing his duty. And we think so far that's probably true. Um, Middle of page 140, 140. Yes, all advantages of sitting still when he ought to move, and of leading a life of mere idle pleasure, and fancying himself extremely expert in finding excuses for it. He can sit down and write a fine, flourishing letter full of professions and falsehoods. This is what Mr. K thinks, Mr. Knightley thinks. Um, so Mr. Knightley thinks that flourishes and extra profusions are unnecessary and not gentlemanly. Um, Top of next page. No, Emma, your amiable young man can be amiable only in French, not in English. That's an interesting point because at the time there was quite a bit of resentment of the French. Um, let's see. He sees it as a particularly French form of superficial charm. Stereotypes of the French, usually negative, abounded in England then, and the long war raging between Britain and France only exacerbated such feeling. A common stereotype was of the French as a people devoted to gallantry and fine words and display, whose pleasing externals and elaborate courtesy concealed a lack of solid moral values of the English. Isn't that interesting? Um, and let's see, at the top of page middle of page 141. Um, so we see Emma here just discussing the novelty of Mr. Frank Church's arrival. You will excuse my being so much overpowered. If I find him conversable, I shall be glad of his acquaintance. But if only he is a chattering coxcomb, he will not, that's a fop. We know what a fop is. He will not occupy much of my time or my thoughts. And this conversation between Emma and Mr. Knightley, toes the English party line that Mr. Churchill has not done his duty. At the bottom, oh no, this is the middle, page 142. He is a person I never think of from one month's end to another, said Mr. Knightley with a degree of vexation, which made Emma immediately talk of something else, though she could not comprehend why he was so angry. Both participants in this exchange are suffering from some lack of self-awareness. Mr. Knightley cannot perceive that he is expressing a pointed dislike of a man he has not met. That's interesting, isn't it? And Emma cannot perceive that some of Mr. Knightley's words are in reaction to hers. You can just see the argument continuing. At the end of this chapter, the last sentence, she had never for a moment supposed it could make him unjust to the merit of another. So this is an example. While Mr. Knightley does represent the quintessential English gentleman, he's not a stereotype. He does, in this case, harbor some resentment towards Churchill. Then we move into Volume 2. Volume 2 introduces new characters and new plots. On page 145, there's a note that is worth thinking about. Just as the previous chapter promoted Frank Churchill to a character worth discussing in detail, this chapter presents Jane Fairfax in a similar light. Both characters play important roles and will soon appear in Highbury. They come from outside our immediate cast of characters. Emma and Harriet, this is the beginning of the chapter, had been walking together one morning, and in Emma's opinion, had been talking enough of Mr. Elton for that day. I thought that was interesting because she gets tired of subjects and moves on. And poor Harriet, she's kind of a simple thing, and she's not as sharp as Emma is. She could not think that Harriet's solace or her own sins, Emma's own sins, required more, and she was therefore industriously getting rid of the subject of Elton as they returned. After speaking some time of what the poor must suffer in winter, remember that one of the responsibilities of the rich in this society is to care for the poor. Second paragraph. No, I don't need that. Oh, the Bateses. Mrs. Bates and the daughter, Miss Bates, who I hope you are getting the hilarity of that. Miss Bates, the daughter, talks too much, excessively, and flits from one idea to the next without a whole lot of transition. And you can tell, on page 148, there's a huge paragraph, and it's all devoted to what Miss Bates says. Mrs. Bates was married to a clergyman, and there's some explanation here that once if you are married to a clergyman and he dies, what's left for the widow is not the clergyman's salary. That goes on to the next person who becomes the vicar. So Mrs. and Miss Bates are in somewhat depressed circumstances, and we see that throughout. We're going to see them going to events on foot. They don't have a carriage. Um, so Miss Bates is, oh yeah. So how are the Bates connected? The Bateses, Mrs. Bates is Jane Fairfax's daughter. No, that's not right. Mrs. Bates is Jane Fairfax's grandmother. Yes. Um, so my note tells me that this was the lot of many widows of clergymen, for while her husband often enjoyed a good income while alive, once he died, all the income would go to the next person. I already told you that. But and then a few lines later, this note says, Mrs. and Miss Bates are shown to straddle the line between the first rate of Highbury, which would include the Woodhouses, the Westons, and Mr. Knightley, and the lower in the social scale. So there's going to be an event later on where they are included not for the dinner, but for the events after the dinner, suggesting that they have a lower rank in this society. So she takes out her knitting and oh, and they are often associated. Well, I'm on page 146. Um, there's mention of the Coles. The Coles are merchants, and while they're successful, merchants are lower, not very genteel. The hints throughout about the social ranking is really interesting. Um, second paragraph. Um, and Mr. Elton, P.S., is also familiar with the Coles, placing him a little bit in that realm. Now, he is a vicar, so he's got a good income, but he's associating with people who are not as high as the Knightleys and the Woodhouses. Um, oh, yeah, this bit about knitting. I cannot get bogged down in this, but it's really interesting. Knitting, unlike needlework, was not normally practiced by genteel ladies. The Bateses, Mrs. Bates is over on the other page, knitting. Um, It was associated with poorer women for whom knitting was of a practical benefit in supplying everyday articles of clothing. The Bateses' need to economize may be one reason Mrs. Bates has taken it up. So many fun facts to know and tell. If we go over to page 148, this is, yeah, um, it's really the bottom of 147. Look at the size of that paragraph. Austen does not usually convey, if you just look in past pages, Austen uses quite a lot of dialogue and shorter paragraphs of explanation, and sometimes paragraphs which include the interior of Emma. But here is Miss Bates going on. Um, she's and we don't have to read all of this, but holy cow, she talks a lot. Um, at the bottom of page, no, it's the top of page 141, all this spoken extremely fast, obliged Miss Bates to stop for a breath. So the other thing you have to notice is that every time Miss Bates talks, she goes from one idea to another, flitting all over the place. Then on the next page, we have a reference to,